Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today we're continuing on with the Shroud Wars, the panel review series that we have here. And joining me again, the regulars. So we have Hugh Farey there, the Shroud Skeptic. Hey, Hugh. And we all, sorry.
I just said hello.
Awesome. And we also have the Pro-Shroud expert, Bob Rucker, returning. Hey, Bob.
Hello.
And exciting news. Joe Marino recommended somebody new who's never been on the Shroud Wars before, Russ Breault. Hey, Russ.
Greetings.
Awesome to have.
All around the world. What do we have? We have England, we have Toronto, we have Washington State, and we have Atlanta, Georgia.
Awesome. It's an international crew. So awesome, cool. So what I do at the beginning of these, especially for newbies like yourself there, Russ, I kind of turn it over to you and give you some time to just introduce the audience as to who you are, how you got involved in studying the Shroud, and maybe a little bit about your faith journey, if you don't mind sharing.
Oh, sure. I've been involved pretty much all my life, I think. I got involved right out of college in 1980. I was a writer for the college newspaper. As most everyone knows, 1978, you had a whole team of scientists, 33 American scientists go to Turin and access to the cloth for 5 days, round the clock, 120 hours. And of course, this is huge news. I mean, there's news articles coming out about it all the time. And of course, in June of 1980, National Geographic, they did a big spread on it. And I was intrigued by this mystery. I had never even heard of the Shroud of Turin, and much less the thought that there was going to be this team of scientists going over to analyze it. And so I asked if I could write some articles about it, and they gave me permission to do it. And so in the fall of 1980, a 2-part article series came out. I had worked months on it, read a lot of articles, talked to some of the scientists to get some quotes, and man, I was just hooked. I said, man, this is one seriously cool mystery and nobody knows anything about it. And so so it took on a life of its own. And so, years later, I'm incorporated as the Shroud of Turin Education Project. And I brand everything I do as Shroud Encounter. So that's my website is shroudencounter.com. And so I do these Shroud Encounters all over the country, so I've just been, steeped in this for a very long time now, and was one of the advisors for the exhibit to be for the development of the exhibit at the Museum of the Bible this past year up in Washington D.C. and I'm on the board of directors for with Barry Schwartz, who is the documenting photographer on the Shroud project, and his organization STERA, which is the Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association. And Bob and I go back a ways. We was at his conference that he put on in 2017 in Pasco, Washington, so I met Hugh. I met you in 2018. Or was it in Canada? Where were we in Canada?
It was in Toronto. It was Gary
Chang.
Gary Chang's sort of I don't know, Christian college or university there.
I can't remember the town though. But anyways, so that's
Ancaster.
Thank you, and Ancaster, and that's so that's where I met you, Hugh, and then but anyway, that's just kind of my experience with it and background in it, and I'm more involved with the Shroud now than ever, and no one ever thought that was going to happen when you first get involved in 1980, which I'm sorry to even believe that's this life. I'm convinced it's another life. But that's my story, Dale.
Awesome. I was gonna make a joke, but I was too afraid. I was gonna say I wasn't even born in 1980, but it's been a long time. Awesome. All right, cool.
Okay.
Sorry. All right, cool. So welcome. Yeah, Russ, it's gonna be great. I'm familiar with your work as well. I've watched a load of your shows, and watched you on the Guy Powell podcast and stuff. So yeah, it's going to be welcome to the Shroud Wars here. All right, cool. So for today, we've got at least 2 topics planned, depending on the timing. I may give Russ some extra time to speak about other things, but so basically we're going to be looking at the various empirical dating evidences that claim to place the shroud in the 1st century. And first thing I'll do, and then the next one is the textile evidence for and against the dating of the shroud. And just starting with the empirical dating. So this was covered in my Shroud solo show part 3, and I'll just share my screen here. And by the way, for each of the panelists, if you guys want to, when you present, you can share your screen at any time as well. All right, cool. So just going over it very quickly here. So the first one that I mentioned was Ray Rogers' microchemical test, whereby he kind of used microscopic analysis to examine some of the shroud's fibers. And Ray Rogers looked at the damage of those, and he compared that to the flax fibers from the Dead Sea Scrolls and said, look, they look similar, the same amount of damage. So they must date to the same period, between 250 BC to 70 AD. Then we get into Giulio Fanti's various physical dating tests. So for example, in the mid 2010s, he came out with the first 3 that I mentioned on my part 3 show. So he has the FTIR dating that gave him a result 300 BC plus or minus 400 years. And I should full screen that because people can see it. He also has Raman spectroscopy, which dated it to 200 BC plus or minus 500 years, and then his tensile strength test at 372 AD plus or minus 400 years. And then putting that together, he was able to get a date of about 33 BC plus or minus 250 years with a claimed 95% degree of certainty. So that's similar to the carbon-14 dating. Remember, 95% degrees, or this 2 sigma level, is an international statistical standard that you need to get. But then we also have something that I didn't include. So the new X-ray dating that was done in 2021 to 2022. And that dated the shroud apparently to the 1st century. And in one of his papers, he compares it to something that's dated between 54 to 74. So that's why I put that there. But yeah, at the very least, it dates to the 1st century. So that's the first topic that we're going to cover. And that's it for my take. And I'll step out and let the panelists go and give their opening presentations. So Russ, since you're new, let's start with you. What's your take on these various empirical dating?
Well, I just admire the creativity and the resourcefulness of Giulio Fanti. Here we are, what was carbon dated in 88. What's this year? We're coming up on 2023, but 35 years past carbon dating. No attempt to date it again. We all know about the ridiculous sample location that was chosen, 1 sample from the outside corner edge. I mean, and now historically, we know, I don't know how much you guys know about, but now we know that corner was held and handled over 275 times from 1413 until 1694, when it was finally and permanently installed in the Guarini Chapel there in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin. But all the exhibitions annually prior to that was all held up, handheld, on platforms outside where people could see the shroud for hours. And then they would rotate people as well, because everyone wanted an opportunity to hold the cloth that ostensibly was the burial shot of the crucified and risen Christ. So there are probably literally thousands of different hands holding that precise corner that was cut for carbon dating. So, I mean, of all the most stupidest things you could do would be to pick your 1 sample. The whole thing hangs on 1 sample from this particular location is just an absurdity that I just still can't wrap my head around. So having said that, I admire Fanti's creativity in to say that, well, I guess they're not going to let us carbon date it again. So maybe there must be some other ways that we can date this cloth. And so I think that looking at the natural deterioration of cellulose over the years, whether you're looking at, Fourier transform, infrared spectroscopy, Raman spectroscopy, whether you're looking at this wide angle X-ray scattering, whatever technique you want to use, I think, but when you are comparing it to other linens, made of a comparable material, flax, and then you can, compare them, I think that's a reasonable way to assign, a wide age parameter. I mean, Fanti's margin of error is 500 years. I mean, so he's giving it a broad measure here, and it's so I just think it's an interesting approach. I know that the carbon labs and the carbon dating purists will cry foul and say it's unsubstantiated, it's undocumented, it's this and that. But hey, I give them an A for creativity, and I give them an A for effort. And what needs to happen is more samples be made available so we can do some decent testing. So that's my take on it.
Awesome. All right, cool. And Bob, what's your take on these various empirical tests, dating tests?
Yes, I've been trying to specialize on the carbon dating with my background in nuclear engineering, and then after I think pretty much dealt with that issue, then I started expanding the whole concept to explain how the image was formed as well. And so, I have a new hypothesis on that, the vertically collimated radiation burst hypothesis. But in the process of all that, I also make presentations, and I just finished a full day Shroud conference down in the Phoenix area, where I spoke from 8:30 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon, with breaks, of course. But in that process, I went through probably about 250 PowerPoint slides. So I was wondering here if I could just put my list of date indicators up, and I have 15 of them. What you mentioned were the last two.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah. Go ahead and share your screen.
Can I write them down?
Hugh's going to write them down for us.
Share screen. Okay, hold on.
He's got his.
This is my whiteboard. This is what I teach from.
Okay, can you see it or not?
Yep. Got carbon dating, gold flecks from coins.
Sure. So what I did here, and this is one item that just to give people a complete perspective on the various attempts, various evidences that there are, and just trying to cover the whole field. Now, so what I've done is that I start with number one, carbon dating, dated at 1260 to 1390. And then based upon the date that's indicated, then and Hugh, I can send these to you if you want to consider them. But anyway,
Oh yeah, I'd love to.
sure. And anyway, so then I go back in time. These are sequential, back in time. So then the next one, the gold flecks that on the shroud, based upon the coins that were rubbed on the shroud, indicate a date of prior to 1204. These would be Byzantine coins, and the various coins that were rubbed, of course, there was a degradation in the quality of the coins, becoming, starting off fully gold, and then gradually decreasing in purity. So that's how the little flecks of gold that are on the shroud can be utilized for dating of the shroud. And then we have the Hungarian codex or manuscript that's dated from 1192 to 95. And then number 4 is invention of the spinning wheel, that's relatively uncertain, but it seems to be that in the area of Israel, it would come available somewhere around 1200 AD. I think it was invented in India, and it gradually spread into Europe. So then number 5 is the approximate 8x2 cubit size of the shroud. And so just the size of it, there's various different cubits, but each cubit, I believe, was from the elbow up to the tip of the middle finger. But the exact size would depend on exactly who the ruler was, because that dimension would change somewhat. But it's fairly close, I guess, to 8x2 cubit size, which makes it ancient. And I don't have a good year for that. But then coins with the image of the face would indicate a date of 695. The Sudarium of Oviedo, which has a historical connection to the Shroud of Turin, left Jerusalem, I believe, in 570 AD. So it goes back that far. Ancient paintings go to about 550. There's a range of estimate here between 550 and 600 AD for the Christ Pantocrator painting. Let's see if we can go on here. And then the next slide, I just show what the Sudarium is here. This was the face cloth. And then number 8 would be crucifixion was outlawed in 337. And so it's unlikely that you'd have a memory of just how crucifixion was done, except there were some places in the world where it was still practiced even after it was outlawed in the Roman Empire. And so that what I'm saying here is that each one of these date indicators, you would have to say, well, that's not 100% proof. That's not 100% proof. That's not 100% proof. But I think there's an accumulation of evidence here, which becomes persuasive. And then we have ancient traditions, number 10, ancient traditions, bringing it back to probably prior to the 2nd century. And then I think one of the better date indicators is the unique stitch on the shroud, which connects the side piece, which is about 3.2 inches wide. It connects the side piece to the main shroud. And it appears as though that side piece, based upon the continuity of the striations in it, continuity of the striations between the side piece and the main shroud, that it was actually cut off from the main shroud and then sewn back on, perhaps in the manufacturing process. Maybe someone made a mistake and cut it off, thus violating the 8x2 cubit rule, and then was told to sew it back on, which they did. And so the stitch there is actually a unique stitch. It's not identical to anything else, but it's most similar to a stitch that was found on a piece of cloth in Masada. So that therefore the best date for that stitch would be prior to 100 AD. And then of course, if you believe that this really is Jesus, and I've had people look at it for just 2 or 3 seconds, in the National Geographic, June 1980, and they say, well, that's Jesus. And in other words, they automatically identify it as Jesus. Well, when you do that, then of course, Jesus died somewhere between 30 and 33 AD, the best evidence indicates. I think they have a better grasp on the exact day that he died than the year. There's a little bit of uncertainty on the year that he died. But the date was actually related to the phases of the moon, because it's related to Passover, which is related to the phase of the moon. And then number 13, possible coin over right eye. So if that is present there, and I realize there's quite a bit of doubt on that, and I might give that a probability of probably less than 50%, but it is interesting, and it's not been confirmed by subsequent analysis. But it may be that that's because someone touched the eye during 1978. So there's a lot of unknowns on this. It is interesting. And it's a possible coin. Lepton, mended by Pontius Pilate, was the initial evidence for it, which would be a dating of 29 to 32 AD. And then you have Giulio Fanti's 3 different tests related to reflectance and tensile strength, which would date it to 33 BC to plus or minus 250 years. And then finally, the radiation damage to the fibers, according to Ray Rogers, had a very similar number of, what would you call it, radiation paths, ionization paths across the fibers, similar to the Dead Sea Scrolls, which dated to about 250 to 70 AD. So those would be my 15. So number 16 then would be the new methodology that Giulio Fanti came up here with, or De Caro was the primary author of X-ray dating of the shroud. So my take on this, I tried to read it yesterday, and a lot of times scientific papers become not understandable. Yeah, even for me, and you know, my background is science. But what I found here was there was a lot of things that I didn't understand. There was a lot of specialty going on with the equations and where the equations came from and whatnot, and even the curves that he showed were not entirely clear as to what he's getting at. And I did not understand what the x-axis was, the Q value. Didn't understand what that is. And so there's a lot that I don't understand. But then he also gets into a lot of consideration with humidity and the temperature. And he then concludes that the value that was actually measured on this was unlikely to be consistent with the carbon dating, because that would have to be at a very high temperature for the 7 centuries it's only existed according to carbon dating. It would have to have existed all that time at a very high temperature, which is unlikely based upon the locations where it has been kept. So that based on those temperature considerations, the conclusion in the paper was that it could well indicate a consistency with about 2 millennia of age. In other words, this is not an extremely precise dating mechanism, and there was a lot of uncertainty in the process. And as Russ said, this is a brand new dating technique. And if you think of carbon dating, how the accuracy and the size of the sample that was required when it was first invented, there's been tremendous advancements in carbon dating technology over the decades since it was created. And I suspect we'll have the same type of thing here. So that this is a brand new technology. The initial evidence on the Shroud of Turin has a very large uncertainty to it. And so I think you conclude that it's unlikely to be consistent with the carbon dating and possibly indicating an age of up to 2 millennia. So, you know, given all of those qualifications, I think we have to wait and see how this dating technique develops. And it's going to have to be used on many more types of fabric in order to get a much larger database for comparison.
Well, as the old saying goes, necessity is the mother of invention. And when you're not allowed to carbon date it again, then you come up with other ways of dating it. And so I think that's why I think it's a very, you know, creative idea
Yes.
that's been applied here. And even Fanti and De Caro and all of them, you know, fully admit that this needs to be tested further on additional samples. But it does give you know, and an interesting indication. And it's so.
All right, cool. So turning to Hugh then for your opening take, what's your take on these empirical dating techniques that have been used? Hope you're muted, just so you know.
Hugh,
you're still muted.
you need to unmute your mic.
Oh, sorry, I was coughing earlier, so I muted myself.
Okay.
I'll just deal with Giulio's techniques, if I may. We've covered most of the others in great detail. If anybody wants me to comment on their views about other things, I'll do that. I agree with Russ in that if we could find a different way of dating material, archaeological material, other than radiocarbon dating it, that would be terrific. There's nothing better than having two systems which correlate to one another, because then you can see if the two things agree, then you go, yeah, that makes sense. And if they disagree, then you try the experiment again until you find out that the two dating techniques give you the date that you think is probably most likely. Of course, perhaps the best one for most archaeological sites is dendrochronology, is tree ring dating, because we can find a piece of textile or something like that, check its radiocarbon date, and as we do now, if there is actually a piece of tree that's part of the archaeological site, we can check it against the tree, and we've got a continuous record of tree rings from the present day to about, I don't know, 10,000 BC, perhaps more, so that we can literally check a piece of wood found on a site by the tree rings. We don't need carbon dating. Trouble is, of course, you can't do that with the shroud. So when we're looking at the shroud or the textile, what you're looking for is something that works like a clock. And the trouble with mechanical and, to a certain extent, radiation defects is that it doesn't work like a clock. The mechanical defects very largely depend, or mechanical deterioration, I should say, depends on three really important things. The first one is temperature, the second one is humidity, and the third one is bending it and folding it up and wrapping it round in circles. Literally, the mechanical treatment of it. And our problem is that it's terribly, terribly difficult to judge a material on objectively on all those three things. Now, I find, I don't think that as it stands, Giulio's method is going to achieve any kind of prominence. He's had 5 or 6 years now. His paper hasn't been read by most archaeologists, let alone commented on. And can I share the screen, because I'm going to show you why?
Yep,
if I may.
Yep, for sure.
Okay, can we see this?
Yes.
This is Giulio's collection of tested threads that he knew the date of, and so which he used for his calibration curve. Because obviously, whatever magic number you got out of the shroud, it wouldn't mean anything unless you can calibrate it with the magic numbers that you've come up with other things. Now, you can see that we start with a collection of textiles. They start with A, that's modern, and they end with L2. Now, I don't know, and I'm hesitated to be unkind, but what happened to C, E, G, H, I, K, H is there, but all the ones in between, did they exist at all, and were they rejected out of hand beforehand?
Yeah, he started off with far more samples than this, but he apparently eliminated them because he felt that they were
too.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and then these are the ones that he actually did use.
Wait,
and from the samples.
Sorry, Hugh. Like, what's the reason he eliminated them? You guys are about to say.
Well, I don't know. He doesn't say.
Okay, Russ, do you know?
They were inappropriate for one reason or another. I mean, he did mention that, for example, he could have used fibers from the Akeldama shroud, which is the only other second temple period burial shroud ever been discovered, but rejected it on the grounds that the tomb in which it was found was very damp and the shroud had fallen to pieces, as indeed most of those early shrouds have.
Okay. All right. Cool.
So that might be part of it.
I think
So
that's why many of them were rejected, because of the environmental the conditions that they were, you know.
So these were the ones that were not rejected on environmental grounds, and he extracted from them certain numbers of fibers, which you could see in column 4, fibers extracted. And he lists the number of fibers that he extracted from each one. And then he looked at all these fibers and he rejected a fair number of them, as you can see. And then during the course of testing them, he rejected a whole lot more. So that the ones that were finally used to produce his calibration graph are the ones in column 1, 2, 3, 4, column 7, where it says fibers used. And as a percentage, oops, move that out of the way. As a percentage of the fibers that he started with, you can see that, well, one of them, the cloth from the Quarantal cliff in Israel, he started with 4 fibers and they all seemed satisfactory. But for some of them, down, especially the older ones, we've got 40%, 30%, 24%. That's the one from the early Middle Ages in El Fayum. Now, this kind of selection, it cannot but make you think that there's a certain amount of subjectivity about this. And that's why it'll never appeal to mainstream archaeologists. What you've got to do is to take a textile, grab a handful of fibers and test those fibers, regardless of what they are, unless you can come up with a very objective way of rejecting them. You can say, oh, I'm only going to take white ones instead of black ones. That perhaps would be a good idea, because the black ones would be all rotten and decomposed. But unless you give a very, very clear description of exactly how you chose your fibers, then it's going to be difficult to persuade anybody that your graph is not at least perhaps unconsciously, subjectively biased towards giving you the result that you were hoping for.
So Hugh, it's kind of like the British Museum not providing all of the raw data to Nature in 1989, and which was what Tristan Casabianca published in Archaeometry in 2019. And it's you know,
couldn't possibly say, but these. Well, I think you can see from the data. This is, I mean, Giulio's been quite clear about it. This is not. I didn't have to get a Freedom of Information request to force him to publish this data. It was there in his paper. Bless him. But that's the reason why it's not going to achieve vast acceptance.
Now, you know, Hugh, I agree with you. I think that you know, but I think what Fanti, at least what I take away from Fanti, is that even though I probably need to talk to him about what was the criteria that he was using as to why he would accept or reject a particular fiber from each one of these different samples, you know. But assuming he had a reasonable basis, you know, I still come away with thinking that, you know, it seems to me to be a valid thing to compare the natural aging, however we want to define natural aging, however we want to measure it or assess it. You know, it's that this comparison concept seems theoretically to me holds water. Now, how we apply it, how we go about it, you know, whether this is the right way or X-ray is the right way or some other way that we haven't even used yet. It's but it seems to me to be a valid approach by comparing it to other linens of a known age, you know, where we you know, so again, so
awesome.
that'd be my comment.
Only if you choose choose your right samples, I could get a modern bed sheet, and provided it had been slept in enough, I could make it at 2000 BC right up to 2000 AD just by picking the right fibers out of it and measuring them in exactly the same way. I'm absolutely certain that would be really easy to do. Of course, I'd reject this one because it was too wrinkled, and I'd reject that one because it's obviously damp, and I'd reject this one, and then I'd come up with the ones which, funnily enough, would exactly fit my original premise. Now, would I be allowed to go on to the X-ray, the recent X-ray experiment?
Yeah, I was just going to say, as the host, just to make sure I'm fair to all sides, Hugh, you can give your opening case like uninterrupted, unless you don't mind. But yeah, give your opening case, and then
then I'll stop after this. Right. So the X-ray experiment was done on pieces of thread. It wasn't done on individual fibers. So what Giulio did, and he's got little pictures of it in his paper, is get a tiny tuft of thread. Where's my fingers here? Probably something like 5 millimeters high, something like that, and pass the X-ray scattering machine up and down it, taking various readings from it. And he describes that in great detail in it's Liberato di Caro, but it's basically Fanti's behind it. But Liberato did the actual work, I think. And he describes how he's taken these threads, and then from that he had to produce a completely new calibration scale. The trouble was that he used exactly the same textile samples that Giulio used in his paper. And as we can see, we find that around about 50% of those samples were unsuitable for dating. So how come they were unsuitable for dating when Giulio did it, but they were suitable for dating by doing it with X-rays? That seems to me perverse. I mean, for example, the sample from, let's take the weakest one, the sample from El Fayum in Egypt was only a quarter of the threads taken from that piece of textile were found to be appropriate for Fanti's dating, and yet the whole thing was taken for doing the De Caro's dating process. And that seems to me that the two things, they don't coincide as well as they should. And I just don't think. We say, give it 10 years and see if archaeologists rise to the bait. But unless we can come up with a more objective way of choosing our samples, I don't think they're going to make it. So that was my assessment of it. It's all there in Medieval Shroud if anybody wants to read it.
Awesome. So so that's your opening case finished.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So now what I'll do, I'll open it up so you guys can kind of have like an informal back and forth and discuss some of the criticisms or what you guys make. I guess I'll start with Russ since he went first in this round. Yeah, is there anything you want to discuss with the panelists about these dating methods?
No, I understand, and I understand the weaknesses that Hugh is pointing out regarding Fanti's method. Again, my understanding is that Fanti, eliminated certain fibers because he didn't feel like they were representative or whatever. I think we'll have to get Fanti on here and maybe Liberato. What's his name? I know Mr. De Caro, who wrote the article and did all
Signor
the work.
De Caro.
And I think obviously Fanti's involved because he provided the samples, that he had already done all the heavy lifting to basically find all these different samples of all these, various cloths. And so the, I was looking, I know in one of your previous Shroud War episodes, I think you kind of covered in more detail the Hungarian Prey manuscript. And Bob, you mentioned it as one of your 15 proof points in terms of dating the cloth older than the alleged date range of 1260 to 1390. I wanted to mention this though, and I'm not trying to get back into a big chat about the Hungarian Prey manuscript, but something that really is intriguing to me, if you recall that that picture, and Hugh, maybe you have a thought on this, is that, of course, we talked about the zigzag lines that correlate with the herringbone pattern weave, and of course, the L-shaped pattern of holes. But something that rarely gets mentioned is the fact that, when you think of a burial shroud, any one of us can be buried in a burial shroud. You can order one off of Amazon right now, $300, comes with straps, and it measures 6 by 9 feet. And it's but the measurements of the Shroud of Turin are very unique. It's 14 feet long, 3.5 feet wide. This would seem to be a rather unusual arrangement for a burial shroud. Yet on the Hungarian Prey manuscript, that's exactly what is represented. You see a long rectangular cloth enveloping the body lengthwise, which is exactly what we see on the shroud. And I just saying that just amazes me. And it's, I just thought I'd mention it out there because I know it wasn't, that particular attribute was not touched upon in your previous talk. And again, I am convinced that historically the shroud was in Constantinople in 1204 and stolen during the Fourth Crusade. I mean, I am absolutely certain of it. And it's, and which, already, that's already older than the oldest carbon date of 1260. And and I think the Hungarian Prey manuscript is a big piece of that.
Awesome.
Hugh,
Just thought I'd throw that out.
Hugh, did you want to take your slide off?
Sorry, yeah, of course. Stop share. Here we go. Yep.
Yes, Russ mentioned the Prey manuscript or codex. And last time I was talking with Hugh, we had a little disagreement as to the stair-step arrangement that's shown on the on the item. Let me share what I have up now.
Okay. So just while you're bringing that up, it sounds like all the panelists are kind of agreed in terms of the empirical tests. They're at best suggestive, but more confirmation is needed on certain things before we should believe the shroud equals that date or something. Is that what
I would say that there's still a large uncertainty involved in it.
Well, I would say personally that there's as much uncertainty about Fanti's method as there is about the carbon 14, is because now you have the results of Tristan Casabianca's work showing that the one carbon 14 dating sample is not homogeneous. And you have Roger's work that certainly shows that it is not representative of the main body of the shroud. So, I think we have a lot of problems with dating the cloth, not just Fanti's method. We obviously have problems with carbon 14 as well.
Gotcha.
At least as regards to this artifact. I'm not impugning carbon 14 in general, but as they say, bad sample is bad data. And and I think that's what we have here.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
so anyway, this slide shows where I would identify the stair-step arrangement in the 3-to-1 herringbone twill weave of the Shroud of Turin. Okay, and that's why I would say that what we see, just a second. What we see here on the Shroud of Turin, this stair step here, is a good indicator that this really is the Shroud of Turin, based upon
But look at the dimensions of that cloth. Look how it is a long, narrow, rectangular cloth enveloping the body lengthwise, which is exactly what we see on the Shroud of Turin.
It all fits.
Well,
Yeah.
Russ, let me kind of raise, so again, the pre-codex is last show, but I'll just rate what he was saying, if you could keep that up there, Bob. what the Shroud skeptics say is, look, yeah, but you're assuming that that's the cloth, right? Because for Hugh, he's saying, no, this is like the tomb, this is the lid, and this is the shroud. So like, since you're new, like Rusty, like what would you say to an objection?
I see what you're saying. Yeah, I guess it's a different interpretation. I see it as a cloth, but you know.
Yeah, cool. All right, same here. I agree with you. But go ahead.
If that was the only picture of its kind that we had, I'd find it very difficult to disagree with you, Russ. But you will have seen in Toronto my massive poster, which I think had 30 of these pictures. And I myself have a database of something like 300 of them. It's a great classic piece of Christian iconography. The three women visiting the tomb. There you go. Now, what do we notice? Every single case, we have a box. And in almost every case, in fact, I think every case except the bottom left-hand corner, we have a lid. The angel is on the lid. The angel is pointing to whatever there is in the box. Now, these particular ones, they're all based, I think, on what I would say Byzantine or Eastern Orthodox interpretations of the scene. We notice that the ladies are coming from the left rather than from the right. We notice that the body is trussed up like an Egyptian mummy and not like not wrapped in an ordinary shroud. But we also see that the box and the lid are an integral part of the whole scheme. Now, this one picture, the Pray manuscript, is the only one in the entire history of Christianity that has the three women visiting the tomb, but no tomb, according to you. Now, in fact, I'm certain that the square thing is the square thing with the crosses on is the tomb. The square thing with the zigzags on is the lid, and the scrumpled up thing is the shroud, as it is in Bob's top right-hand corner of the picture where you showed 6 of them. You see that? Wait, go to your top right-hand corner now. Can you see the angel there is pointing to the shroud crumpled up in a heap?
Yeah, but the problem that I have with this interpretation, Hugh, is the fact that you on the Hungarian Pray, you have the sudarium, which is kind of the cloth that was about his head, obviously pictured to be viewed as kind of inside the cloth, and yet kind of protruding out of the top of it. I don't see that here in these other ones. I just think that yes, it is similar to these, but yet at the same time, I see it as also.
It is utterly unique in the history of Christian iconography if those rectangular things are not the sarcophagus and its lid.
Yes, could I?
Maybe it is. Maybe it is.
I'd
Go ahead.
like to present the counter evidence here. On all of the sarcophagus, we see a definite thickness. You can see the wall thickness here. You see you can look down into the inside of the sarcophagus. You're not just looking at one side of it, whereas what we have here, this and this are just paper thin. There's no thickness to them at all. And Hugh, I think you said that this section here is the side of the sarcophagus. Well, yeah. If this is the front side, then where's the back side? And how? Where do you see inside? And then
I agree. It's not a very good drawing.
Yeah, it's totally different.
No, there are lots. There are plenty of other. I mean, you've chosen 6 there, which are all.
Yeah, but this one also has the face image on Mary's right arm, and you don't see that on these other ones.
Right here, of course, you have the face here, and you see the knife here that cut the shroud and removed the face and gave it to this woman on the left, which presumably based upon her halo is the most prominent, thus being Mary. And so it gave the image of Jesus to marry. So the image came from the cloth. And so what you have here is not the shroud, but it's the remaining cut-in from the shroud. So
Well, I didn't mean to bring up the whole thing about Gary and Pray. I know you went over this on a previous show. I just am taken with the dimensions of it, and so.
Gotcha.
But
yes, and in none of the sarcophagus do you have red crosses.
No, that's true. Nor on the shroud, in fact.
All right, cool. So cool. No, I'm happy. Thank you, Russ, for bringing up the pre-code. It's good that you kind of followed up and brought a new aspect to discuss there. But Hugh, I just, before I end this kind of segment, it sounds like we're kind of done about these empirical dating tests. Now, Russ brought up a good point. So next week, for fans of the show, I will be bringing on Giulio Fanti to specifically address some of the objections that we're working on. He was kind enough to send me written objections because obviously Giulio doesn't speak English. That's why he couldn't be on this show and like interacting in real time type thing. But he will be on next week to address some of the objections here. But before
I think they were questions, not objections, weren't they?
Or yeah, challenges or questions. Well,
Queries for clarification.
Very well. All right, cool. So Hugh, do you think you've laid out your entire case regarding it and you're happy to move on to the next segment on the textile stuff? Or
I just wanted to read a bit from Thermochimica Acta, which was Rogers's thing about radiation. And he says the crystalline structure of flax fibers acts like a dosimeter. It collects radiation defects over time, which is rather what the X-ray, De Caro's X-ray things were designed to test. Unfortunately, background radiation varies greatly with storage conditions and latitude. Radon collects in old buildings and tombs. Alpha particles cause short, intensely birefringent ionization tracks. Electromagnetic radiation, such as ultraviolet, X-ray, and gamma ray, causes diffuse background birefringence that varies with location and linen production methods. Neutrons produce recoil protons in the interior of fibers, and energetic protons produce long ion tracks that occasionally branch. Radiation-based age estimation is very subjective. However, defect populations indicate that the shroud's linen has been absorbing several kinds of radiation for a very long time. So he's not very precise on the variation that radiation could do. But there you go.
I'll turn it to just before we move on, Bob and Russ. You've kind of given your take about Fanti's tests, but what about Rogers' comparison to the Dead Sea Scrolls? Do you guys have anything to add about that before we move on? Or
well, I think Rogers, comparing fibers from the main body of the shroud with fibers taken from the C14 sample is very instructive, that they are different. And it's he goes into in his Thermochimica Acta article, he goes into a great length about lignin and the decay of vanillin and that there's no vanillin remaining in the main body of the shroud comparable to the wrappings of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yet in the carbon-14 sample, there's about 30% remaining, and which is suggestive of a different age or a different something. And it's and even kind of validated with spectroscopy. He thinks that corner has been manipulated or has been repaired or rewoven or something, because there's 20 times the amount of aluminum in that corner versus fibers from the main body of the shroud. Why is such a big difference? Well, aluminum would be one of the constituent components of some kind of mordant, or part of the madder root dye that he says he found on the carbon sample. So now whether the so I don't know. There's to me, I think Rogers has built a pretty strong case that there's something awry with that corner, and then you couple that with the was as Hugh mentioned, the fact that Tristan Casabianca, here we've been asking for the raw data, for all the C14 tests for 30 years. Finally, we get it under the duress of a Freedom of Information Act, and lo and behold, all the raw data was not provided to Nature. Gee, I wonder why. It is because it would not have passed the typical chi-squared test for reliability. They would not have achieved their 95% confidence level, and they would have had to go out and realize that this sample is not homogeneous, and it's so as we learn from Watergate, the cover up is always worse than the crime. Publish all your data and then figure out why there are these variations. But when you're using multiple labs, there's supposed to be at least a 60% of correlation or agreement between the labs. And yet when you factor in all of the data that was excluded from the Nature report, that agreement drops down to 28%. And so clearly there was something going on with that carbon sample. But anytime you leave out the data and you're forced to provide it under a Freedom of Information Act, that doesn't pass the smell test. And now Tristan Casabianca isn't saying that the new data suggests something other than medieval. He's just saying that sample is not homogeneous. It appears to be, that whether it's just subject to some kind of contamination or reweave, or maybe even if Bob would wax eloquent on neutron flux, I don't know. All I know is that when you limit the most significant carbon dating event of the 20th century to one sample taken from the outside corner edge, a sample that we know has been handled over 275 times. I mean, it's like, gee, I wonder what could go wrong. And it's and so I think, so that's kind of what we're up against. We're up against all these other dating methods that are less than desirable, but we're also up against a carbon date that is also less than desirable. And it's so it's like, what do you do? It's almost like you kind of say, well, it's inconclusive and we need to do the whole thing all over again. So
Gotcha. All right, Bob. Yeah, Bob.
I think that a good subject, Dale, for this type of discussion would be to discuss Ray Rogers' paper, because I don't agree with it. I basically disagree with his work and his results.
Well, how can you disagree with chemistry?
Oh, well, I'll tell you.
So we can go into the details of it, and that would be appropriate for another program.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, definitely. I'll set that up for you guys. But I do want to make sure we include the next section again, because Russ does have time limits. So the textile evidence, this is a key dating indicator, and it's something I covered in my Shroud solo show part 3 as well. Why is this my Zoom's frozen? I was wanting to share my screen, but I guess okay, so I'll just let you know what I said, and I can't share my screen. Okay, so my computer's frozen. Can you guys still hear me?
Yeah, we're hearing you.
Okay.
And see you.
Yeah, and see me. Okay, so I'm just gonna have to talk. So, okay, here we go. Finally, it's working. Share screen. Okay, so I'm just gonna read my slides so it's not waste time here. Okay, so basically with the textile evidence, I laid out a few lines of evidence based on my memory of what I was said. I gave 4 positive ones. So one was based on the size.
Oh,
and
now you're
maybe I could make some comments.
Yeah, do.
Okay.
he's back.
okay. Here, can you guys hear me now? Everything's good?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I was saying in my textile thing, I gave 4 pro dating things. Number 1, it fits the Jewish qubits based on Assyrian qubits. It's 8 by 2. I think as well, based on memory. I talked about the strip along the cloth fits with the Gospels data of there being multiple cloths or that sort of thing. What else? Oh, the one objection was like the 3-to-1 twill. We do have examples of complex weaves like this that date centuries before Jesus and that sort of thing.
Really?
One of the other things I said is about the fold patterns in the cloth. That's related to the textile, and there are certain water stains that, if you fold the cloth in a certain way, that would fit into an ancient pot that wasn't around in medieval period. So that's another way of kind of dating it, the textile, to ancient times. So just based off my memory, without my slides here, those are some of the aspects I said in my Shroud Solo Show Part 3. But that said, I'm going to turn it straight to the experts. So yeah, I guess we'll start with Bob this time. What's your take on the textile evidence? Can we date the shroud using that at all, or?
Well, unfortunately, I haven't looked into that issue, so I really shouldn't speak to it. I'm sorry, Dale.
No problem. Okay, Hugh or Russ, yeah, go ahead. You were about to speak.
Well, my understanding, I wrote a chapter on this and looked at, there is any number of, so let me back up. So some of the things that would question that, can you produce a cloth this size? Well, they did have Egyptian looms that could make fabric of this size. They were harvesting flax back in that day. The question is, could a shroud made of linen, survive 2,000 years? And the answer is yes, providing it was, kept in a relatively dry environment. It would, in fact, the curtains from King Tut's tomb are made out of flax, and they date to 1300 BC. You have examples of different twill weaves that have been found. In fact, we even found one that's even more complex than the shroud. It's called a diamond twill pattern, and all these date from circa 1st or 2nd century. And it's so I came to the conclusion that one of the things we don't have is that we don't have a lot of examples of ancient Jewish burial shrouds. And one of the reasons for that is the Jewish use of ossuaries. And, as they would take, for about 400 years, which encompassed the 1st century, they would take, they would lay the body in the tomb, and then after a year they would come back and the body would be decomposed, and they'd take all those bones, put them into a box about the size of a ice cooler, and they'd etch on the outside of this box who it is who's in this box, and then that way they could actually stack these boxes up in the tombs. You could have multiple people buried in this same tomb through the use of ossuaries. But that's also why we don't have very few burial shrouds that we can compare. I think they found one about 15 years ago that was and the big news of the day was that it was made of a plain weave. And so, the shroud couldn't be authentic because they found a shroud made out of a plain 1-to-1 pattern weave. Well, they failed to take into account the fact that the scripture specifically says that Joseph of Arimathea, a rich man, purchased a fine linen cloth. So we know that whatever Jesus was buried in was not made of a plain weave. And it's so at any rate, I come away with the with the belief, with the certainty that there's nothing to say that the Shroud of Turin cannot be a Jewish burial shroud of circa 1st century based on the textile information. That's my take on it.
One just before I go to Hugh for his opening on the textile, Russ, would you say that there are certain indicators that, at the very least, like John Tyre argued, we can say that the textile is not medieval, even if we can't say it does date to Jesus' time?
Well, I mean, Bob brought up the use of the spinning wheel. It was invented circa 12th century. We know that the threads are hand spun. We know that individual hanks of yarn were used, which is why we have this kind of variegated look as we see, or banding effect that we see on the shroud, because of the use of different hanks of yarn that were bleached differently. My understanding is that by the time you get to the Middle Ages, they would bleach the entire cloth, kind of eliminating that variegated look, or the banding look. And it's so it would, this is why Rogers kind of opens up his paper in Thermochemica, saying that the carbon date was surprising given the technology used to manufacture the shroud. Well, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about how the shroud was woven and bleached and used these individual hanks of yarn, anyway, so I come away with saying, no, I don't have a slam dunk. Here's a precise example of another shroud, just like the Shroud of Turin. We don't have that, is because, I think the shroud was pretty special. It's, here's, Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Sanhedrin. He had access to the temple. He probably purchased this linen from the temple store. He bought linen that was suitable for a high priest about to enter the Holy of Holies. And so this wasn't some ordinary cloth. And so again, another reason why we're probably going to be hard pressed to find another example of it.
Gotcha. All right. Yeah, Hugh, what's your take on the textile evidence then, for and against?
I've got a note of 5 things here. First of all, the cubits. Now, there are at least 1, 2, 3, or 6, about 8 or 9 Roman cubits from the 1st century, in the British Museum, discovered by Flinders Petrie when he went off and explored the Middle East. And there are 1 or 2 others. And also we can derive what a length of a cubit was slightly by looking at architectural features that we know to have been built to a particular number of cubits, or at least we know to have been a particular length, and then try and divide them by the number of cubits that they were. And Herod's Temple is a good example of that. Various archaeologists have tried to choose bits of Herod's Temple and say that we know is 200 cubits long. So if we divide that length by 200, then we'll know what a cubit is. And in every single case, it comes down to round about 440 or so millimeters. No, centimeters. For the length of the shroud would be, oh, hang on, no, that's the wrong thing. It would be about 45 centimeters, which is much too small for the shroud. Now, it was in some desperation, I think it must have been out of desperation, that the chap who was convinced it was something to do with cubits finally found a statue in the British Museum from an Assyrian empire which had become extinct 500 years previously and was anyway 500 miles away, and discovered that that cubit could have been just about 2 of them would have made the width of the shroud. And as we all know, the shroud is roughly 4 times as long as it is wide. And so obviously if the width was 2 cubits, then it would be not too stupid to say that the length was 8 cubits. But of course, what people forget, and which Bob has clearly remembered, is that we've got this side strip here. Whenever the shroud was made, and whatever cubit it was made to, it was originally wider. It's definitely not 4 times. It wasn't made 4 times as long as it was wide. So I think the whole cubit thing is a terrible red herring and should be discarded. There were plenty during the Middle Ages. They used ells, which were about twice as long as a cubit, and sure enough, the shroud is about an L wide, and there were dozens of different measurements of L as well. So we can't specifically say it was made to this or that dimension and to announce, as so many people do, that the shroud is exactly 8 cubits long and 2 cubits wide is just absurd. It has no historical verification at all. Now, the weave and the spinning wheel is an interesting one. Now, I was talking to a lady who was doing some spinning the other day, because we have a lot of these medieval reenactment people. And she was saying you couldn't really tell the difference between hand-spun cloth and spinning wheel spun cloth. It looks exactly the same because it's still fed into the spinning wheel by hand. So you can feed in a little bit more or a little bit less. The spinning wheel is rotated by hand so that the twist on the cloth can be a little bit more, a little bit less. So it's really not possible to say that the shroud was either hand spun or spinning wheel spun. What's more, for at least 100 years, if not more, after the spinning wheel was invented, some people were still hand spinning their yarn because they didn't have a spinning wheel. Then you said this interesting thing about the folding up of the shroud. Well, when you fold up the shroud as it is in so that it would accept those the water seeping up from below, like in those big water stains that were analyzed by whatever his name is, whose name I forget straight off. Yeah, it comes out as a kind of rectangle, and you said, well, it fits into an ancient Jewish storage pot. Yeah, of course it will. It'll fit into any cardboard box or a wooden box or just anything. It doesn't have to be a Masada amphorae. It's just a sort of rectangle size. Where are my hands? A bit like that. It would fit into anything. So I don't think the fact that it could fold up small is evidence of its antiquity. Finally, I have masses of correspondence with 2 lovely ladies, one of whom is, I think, a bit younger than me, Orit Shamir, and the other one is much older than me, Hero Granger Taylor. Hero Granger Taylor analysed all the textiles from the Masada excavations, and Orit Shamir is probably the current leading expert on first century medieval textiles. First century burial textiles. Got my words all screwed up there. And neither of them think that the shroud is compatible with first century technology. Now, one of your problems is, and Russ picked it out beautifully, and that is, how do you make those beautiful diamond shaped diapering that you find in these Damascus silks and things like that? And it's to do with the way that you lift up individual threads and then you pass the shuttle underneath. Perhaps if I did this, you lift up different threads, you pass the shuttle underneath, then you lower them again, and then you lift up a different set of threads and you pass the shuttle back again and you lower them again, and then you lift up a third set of threads. Now, when you're making the kind of herringbone design or the twill design that's been found in antiquity, every single one of those had to be hitched on individually. So you read it, and you can see people doing it today. If you want to see people hand making a pattern which is part of the weave of something, you have to pick up the threads individually, hook them onto a bar, lift the bar up, send the shuttle through, lower the bar, take all those ones down, put a new lot on, and so on. Now, if you did that, and it's perfectly possible to make herringbone twill or diamond-shaped patterns or even birds and things, which the Chinese were doing in that kind of material, what you wouldn't do is repeat the same mistake over and over again. And the shroud has lengthways mistakes that start at the top and they go right the way down the full 14-foot length. And this shows that it must have been made using these shafts that move up and down. And they are much more likely. I have heard somebody saying that this was possible to be done with a warp-weighted loom, which was around in the 1st century, but it's much more likely to have been done using a treadle loom, which is the one where you press a bar and the shafts, you press a bar with your foot and the shafts move up and down, lifting up the correct warp threads. That's all terribly complicated, and again, it's all discussed in detail at medievalshroud.com. Don't miss it. So that's my take on it.
And send me a link to that blog so I can put it up on mine. But Bob, you raised your hand to respond. So for the
okay, yeah, there was just one item, too, that you said that the shroud would have been much wider, twice as wide as it is
Not
now.
twice as wide, but certainly much wider. Yeah.
Much wider. Well, yeah, I think that the shroud is part of a piece of cloth that was made on a much wider loom, and that it was cut down then to the correct length that they wanted. That's all.
Gotcha.
Oh, yeah. Fair enough.
Hugh, I talked to somebody who was a expert on Noah's Ark, and
Oh, yes.
and not that we've found it yet, but he had a funny joke, and he said he was asked, well, what will we know when we find Noah's Ark? And he'll say, well, we'll finally figure out just how long a cubit is.
Well, yes. They do seem to have shrunk over the ages. At about 500 or 600 BC, they were over 50 centimeters. But by the 1st century, they seem to have gone down to about 45 centimeters.
Gotcha. All right, cool. Hugh, did you, so given Bob's response about the cubit thing, the width, anything? You're good with that?
Yes. Well, if it was cut off the loom at its particular length, I mean, I don't really understand whether was the side strip cut off and then put back on in order to make the width 1/4 the length. That was a deliberate policy.
No, it's just a mistake. Someone cut it to the wrong dimension, and the boss came in and said, "What are you doing? That's not the right width. You need another 3.2 inches." Okay, well, I'll put it on then, and they did.
I see it rather. I think I kind of agree. I don't know who said it, but I think it was probably made much wider and then cut down. The whole side strip is a complete mystery. I mean, because it is the same material as the shroud, and yet and you have that interesting seam, which is a curious seam. But it's like no one even knows why it was put there. I think Alan Adler once postulated that perhaps it was added to be like a sleeve, where maybe you would put some kind of a pole through the sleeve to hold it up for public viewing. But I can't find any evidence of the shroud having been displayed that way. Everything I've seen about the shroud is that people are holding it with their hands. I've never seen any kind of sketch or etching or anything showing a pole. And it's, so I don't know. I mean, I guess it's a possibility, but it's nothing that I've been able to verify.
With just Fleury Lemberg's beliefs and speculation that the nature of the stitch is a professional stitch. It's so perfect, it indicated to her as a fabric expert that it was a professional stitch, so that it was not made out in the field somewhere where someone cut off this piece maybe to wrap around the body or something, but it was actually made at the factory, which would indicate that it was just a mistake. They cut it off wrong, and then they attach this piece on to get it the right dimension.
Then you have the DNA evidence that would, remember, you probably read this, where there's some indication that perhaps the cloth was manufactured in India, and perhaps Joseph of Arimathea, being a merchant himself, probably would have had the wherewithal to. I mean, it's just a thought. We don't really know where the shroud was made, but India is certainly a possibility.
So one thing I wanted to add in, because this is interesting and new to me, I thought kind of like what John Jackson did in his presentation, the strip was used to tie the body, and then subsequent it was like sewn back in. But you guys are saying no, it was more done in the manufacturer.
Well, I've spoken to various people, professional embroiderers, who said that if you took a strip off a piece of cloth and then used it for tying things up, you'd never get it back on to match, because it would be so distorted and stretched. No, I think whatever the reason, Bob's right in that it was If it was cut off, it was put back on pretty quickly as such. Now, I quite agree. I think Adler might have had a point, which would also account for the slightly unusual the stitch that's around it, which Fleury Lemberg said she noticed that there was one similar to it at Masada, but she never said that it was unique to Masada. In fact, I'm just looking at my jeans, and I think my jeans have got exactly the same stitch down the seam of the leg as on the shroud. Just look at your own jeans now, which I'm sure you're wearing, and you'll go, "Oh my goodness, look at that!" Oh no, Bob's wearing +4s.
Yes, you know, I think that it is possible that the shroud cloth was made for the temple, but the fact is that the presence of this side piece that was stitched back on would defile it and make it. They would not want it in. They would not accept it for the temple. So that may be why it was available for Joseph of Arimathea to purchase.
Let me ask this then, because so if that's the case, then that might raise. I've heard a lot of Christian shroud skeptics, such as you, but they'll raise the Bible, John 20, and it refers to multiple cloths. So aside from the head cloth, the sudarium, what were the multiple cloths then? If it's not referring to this strip, like how do you guys answer that then?
Strips, wrists, chin, ankles, strips of linen. Remember, John 19:40 says that Jesus was buried according to the burial customs of the Jews. But remember, there were two different customs, one for normal death and one for violent death with significant loss of blood, in which case there's no removal of the clothes, no washing of the body, and the body is simply wrapped in a single cloth called a sovev, which means to envelop or wrap around. And it's and so from that concept, I mean, the shroud seems to correlate with the Jewish tradition of someone who died by violent death.
Gotcha.
Can I share my screen?
Certainly.
Well, Bob raised his hand. I'll go to Bob.
Oh, Rob,
and then-
yeah.
I was going to say something and I forget what it was at this point. I'm sorry.
All right, cool. So over to you, Hugh. Go ahead.
This was an idea I had. Which describes how I think the side screen thing might have been put on. So it originally looked like that, and that the bit under the bar was chopped off, so that we just got these little strips here, and then they're folded over like that, and stitched together like that. And those are the stitches that you can see more or less on the shroud today.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good idea. I just wish I could find some historical documentation that the shroud was actually, held up that way.
Yeah, so do I. You've no idea how much I'd like to find that.
Just can't find it. Yeah.
One thing I would like to ask, so Bob, because when you had on your list that issue about the spinning wheel, so it must be earlier than 1200, I think you had. And here Hugh is saying the opposite. He's saying, well, look, that based on the technology, we can rule out a 1st century date. So I just wanted to turn it to you guys. Do you guys want to go back and forth on that? Does the issue of how the cloth was made in relation to the thing that made it an indicator of the age of the shroud at all, or?
Well, I would think that the shroud was made in a factory. It wasn't just an individual in his own home that made it. It was probably made in a factory that was making various types of cloth, various lengths, various dimensions, various materials. And so therefore, when Ray Rogers said that he was startled to find cotton fibers in the threads, I say, why would he be startled at it? I would expect you to find cotton fibers in the thread. if you're working in a factory where there's various materials. Of course you would. And so that I don't like a lot of Greg Rogers' work on this, and we could get into that. I don't think his evidence for the invisible reweave is very good at all, and so we could get into that.
You could argue reweave, but it's hard to argue chemistry, and it's
well, not really. The only reference Rogers gives regarding the chemistry is that he actually references a fellow worker who published a paper in Thermochimica Acta about a year before he wrote his paper, called Stanley T. Kosowicz. And Stanley T. Kosowicz is still alive and says that Rogers made a complete nonsense of his work, and that he said that Rogers had no authority to do anything about. He made a complete mess of it and got it wrong. And I'll try and find out.
But I mean, Rogers analyzed the samples himself in under the microscope and
yeah, but he didn't know anything about linen, unfortunately. For a start, the amount of lignin in flax is around about 2%, which is almost impossible to detect at all using the fluoroglucinol test which he used. What's more, the flax that he tested with the fluoroglucinol test was pink because it was stained with this madder. And unfortunately, what the fluoroglucinol test does is it stains things pink. So he had no real way of assessing whether there was any lignin there or not. He was of the opinion, using the work of Stanley Kosowicz, which Kosowicz says he shouldn't have done, that lignin deteriorates with age. But I've got a wonderful paper here called The Aging of Cellulose by Theodore N. Kleinert, which looks at ancient Egyptian linen cloth, showing that the lignin content is still 2%, exactly the same as modern content. So lignin simply doesn't deteriorate with age. I mean, there's so much of Rogers' paper that's simply wrong. Where did he get his Dead Sea Scroll samples from? We've got no idea. Nobody mentions it. He gives no reference for it at all. Where did he get his medieval samples from? He gives no reference for any of those at all. I'm afraid.
And just when this is getting heated, I have to go.
Oh, no, I'm not heated. I'm just asking.
I unfortunately,
it's lovely to see you.
I have a hard stop right now because I have to go somewhere else. But it's been I really enjoyed this whole thing, and hopefully we'll do it again. And great seeing you, Hugh, and Bob, and Dale. Nice to meet you, but I've got to run. So you guys can keep chatting away. Okay.
All right. Well, you're welcome back anytime. So
thank you. Bye-bye now. And Merry Christmas.
And Merry Christmas. Yes. Absolutely.
Merry Christmas to you too. Yeah.
All right. So one last thing. So I'm trying to remember all your points because you had about 5 to 6, but one that that comes up is obviously about the twill, right? So about, it's a herringbone 3-1. I know you take issue with that, but so some skeptics say, well, that absolutely rules out a 1st century date. And whereas we come back with, no, we've got examples. So do you and Bob want to discuss that a bit? Like, is it true that it's impossible for the weave of the cloth to have been created in the 1st century or not?
Well, no, no, it's not. I didn't say that it was impossible. I said it was extremely unlikely on the grounds that the both, I may say, Gabriel Weil and I can't remember whether Tyler said it or not, but everyone seems to be agreed that the shroud was made using bars that every single thread was attached to one of 4 bars. And when you lift bar number 1, the first thread comes up and you pass the shuttle underneath it, and then you drop that and you lift bar number 2 and the second thread comes up, and so on. Now, all the damasks made in earlier times, and in fact, even now, those ones with the shapes in them, they're not done with all the threads attached all the time to bars. You change the pattern as you make it. And of course, as you change the pattern, you wouldn't make the same mistake. And the thing that Gabriel Weil noticed in 1988, after the radiocarbon, when he was looking at the shroud, was that the same weave errors occur from the top to the bottom, right the way down the shroud. And that indicates that the loom it was made on cannot have been a loom that was used to make the damasks that we found from those times. Now, that doesn't mean that such a loom was impossible, but there's no evidence of a 4-bar loom ever existing. That's all we can say.
Yeah, Bob, I know you haven't really studied the textile stuff, but do you have anything to kind of say on that front?
I've not studied loom technology, so there you go.
Fair enough then. All right, cool. Well, I guess for the audience sake, I haven't gotten it locked down, but I'm trying my best in the new year to bring on Dr. Irene Tomedi, who is a textile expert. She was involved in the 2002 restoration, so she's studied the shroud and studied it. If I can bring her on, I'm definitely going to address Hugh's criticisms and get her take.
Well, I've asked some questions because it is extraordinary. I mean, it really shocked me. One of the photographs that they took during the restoration shows the back of the shroud folded over the front. It's on shroud.com. It's called something like Lemberg 2 or Mechtild 2 or something like that. And the back of the shroud is very much darker than the front, quite extraordinarily so. And you just think, gosh, I'd like to know Irene's version of that. Is she Italian? Does she speak English, or is she Swiss?
She's Italian. Yeah, she's in Italy. I'm working like through Enrico to organize stuff with her, but I think she speaks English as far as I know. So
super. Yeah, that'd be great.
Awesome.
She's probably quite elderly, huh?
Yeah, well, I tried originally to get Fleury Lemberg, but she's in her 90s, so like she doesn't do anything. But yeah, hopefully that'll come through because yeah. With that said, I think that covers it for the textile.
And who did you get to translate for the last person you had to translate? Because you had a brilliant simultaneous translation.
Me? That was Guy Powell, and that was really expensive. Like Giulio wanted me to use that, but it's really expensive, and it took about 6 weeks. So like, I'm doing it, give me in writing, and as long as he has writing, he can do his thing.
Yeah. But it was really good. Did you see that, Bob?
No.
It's brilliant. It's one of Dale's. Can you remember who it was? I can't even remember who it was now. Was it Andrea Nicolotti? I think you've done it twice.
No, it wasn't me. That was Guy Powell's podcast. He interviewed.
It was his podcast, and right, gotcha. Yeah.
He has the technology to do that, but he was saying it's really expensive. So yeah, there's no way I can.
But it is. I bet it is. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, cool.
Well, if Giulio could write his answers, then and then read them out or something like that.
That's what we're doing. Yeah.
He's a game old bird, Giulio. He will read his answers out in English as best he can, and he's not that bad. You can understand him.
Yeah, exactly. We've had him on the show. That's what we did. Bob was on that show, and it was fine. So
yeah,
awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool. I think we've kind of covered it. Is there anything else about these two categories of evidence that we haven't covered, or do you guys think?
Well, there was just one thing that Bob put. Incidentally, I can't read my writing, Bob. What was your number 9?
Let's see if I can get back to it here. Crucifixion outlawed in 330.
Oh, that's outlaws. I put outlaws here, and all I could think of was cowboys and things. Outlaws? No, outlawed. There we go. Right. Your second or third one was quite interesting, and I thought this was quite a clever one of Giulio's, which was the gold flecks found on that he found amongst the bloodstains or on the cloth somewhere. And he realized that it was an alloy of gold and compared it to all the Byzantine coins he could come across, and he found some coins which had exactly the correct alloy. And then his idea was that the shroud must have been in Constantinople, and then people had either dropped their coins on it or maybe even rubbed the faces of their coins on the cloth so as to sanctify the coin. And I thought that was a really good idea. And it could have been a bit of a blow to the medieval theory. But then I was looking around, and of course, the Vatican is crammed with gold candlesticks, gold thuribles, gold things of all kinds. And gold is always alloyed with other stuff. And I can't believe that there's not a fair amount of stuff in the Vatican which hasn't got exactly the same proportions of impurities as Byzantine coins have.
And couldn't,
but he didn't test any of that.
And couldn't like Byzantine coins have been transferred to Europe?
Of course, yeah. People could have done the same even in Chambéry or Turin, yeah.
Gotcha. All right, cool. Well,
that was my response to the gold flex point, because we haven't mentioned that before.
Yeah, that was a good one. So awesome. All right. Well, I think we've kind of covered it for today. Obviously, we'll be back sometime in the new year. Hugh is going on vacation for.
I'm going to Australia. Yeah.
Awesome. So yeah, probably sometime in February we'll pick up with again the next round of category of evidence. Probably it'll be looking at historical and anatomical accuracies or inaccuracies, as well as possible Bible mentions or stuff like that. So that's probably what we'll have in store for the next one. But other than that, yeah, thank you to both Hugh
if you and your fellow interlocutors can stand my skepticism, then I'm very happy to take part again.
Awesome. All right, cool. So yeah, thank you to Hugh and Bob for joining, and thank you to Russ as well. And I wish you guys a Merry Christmas.
Thank you. Yeah, Merry Christmas.
So